So, I guess it's about time for another one of these. It's actually really overdue for another one of these, but, you know, whatever. I don't have a schedule. I'm lazy. I'm sorry. So, casual game chat, right? Casual game development chat for the pen and paper role-playing game that is currently unnamed, but the project is called Robots! Because that's all I need to know which folder to open if I'm opening folders and actually working on it. Mostly I just work on it during off hours at work, which is why I've got this book, which you can't see because I'm not using my webcam, because that's how I roll. But we're at the stage where I want to tell you about game mechanics because I need some advice on things. I'm concerned about a few things, and I need to resolve my concerns. This is going to require playtesting, which will obviously be on the channel, but having some people theory crafting alongside me would be beneficial. Not necessary. I can get it done. It's just, again, I need to do some game tests, which means I need other things need to happen before they can happen. Oh, so much effort, so much work. Well, that's because what I'm doing is actually not a simple task, but kind of what I figured. However, whilst I do want to talk to you about all the mechanics, all of them, whilst I definitely want to go over how fighting works, because, to be honest, that's all I'm working on right now. I want a very, very solid fighting engine, combat engine. And yes, it's not an engine, it's pen and paper, but still, it's an engine. It's how I think of it. It's a game. Games have engines, that's how they run things. I can't, because logically, all I've talked about is why I'm doing this project. Not what I'm doing, just why. And it's necessary. For this whole thing to make sense, you need to know what we're doing. Well, what I'm doing, and potentially other people. I'm making a pen and paper role-playing game about robots. Yes, I already stated that, but that's what it comes down to. I want a robot fighting pen and paper role-playing game. I want it to be capable of any style of robot fighting. That's extremely, like, that's the core of what I want. Excellent. I essentially want it to be as broad as Anima Beyond Fantasy, in terms of Anima Beyond Fantasy is you can do anything you can do in anime. It also does generic fantasy fairly well, but mostly it focuses on, like, anime. And you can create anything that you see in anime within anima. What I'm working on is a bit more niche and a bit more... It's got a less broad scope. But I want combat to be capable all the way from Metal Gear Rising Revengeance, Raiden-sized, or even smaller, like the smallest available robot would be about the size of a human head. Adult human head. That's how small I want it to go from, and I want it to range up to not quite city-sized giant super death mechs, of which there's, let's say, 2 or 3 in my fantasy world. Fictional world. It's not a fantasy. And I want all those things to be able to interact with one another. I want the smallest to be able to damage the largest and successfully fight the largest while still having strengths and weaknesses, having to completely change the playstyle. I want mechanics that represent that in combat, but we're getting a bit off topic. So I've come up with 5 design goals for this game. And that's essentially what I'm going to read through here. So this should be a fairly quick video, but I'm going to talk about them. This is casual. I'm going to say exactly what comes into my head while I'm talking. And if you want, you can listen to that. If not, I don't know why you're here and have listened to 4 minutes of me rambling already. But let's jump right in. My first design goal is, of course, playability. The game needs to be playable. What I mean by that is the number of rules and roles required in the game I want to be minimized. Not massively, but I don't want it to be... I want minimal rolls between the start of a combat turn and the end of a combat turn. I want minimal rules in the way too, so that you can quickly resolve your turns and keep the game progressing. The more dice you have to roll, and particularly the more rolls made in succession, it slows the game down. The more rules you have to calculate. I played a bit of a game, I've mentioned it before, which was Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura. I translated that into a pen and paper game, but I actually, whilst I enjoy the concept, I'm terrible at GMing it, and yes, I'm a bad GM. Because I keep neglecting entire mechanics, like armor. Because in that game, armor and damage resistance are managed separately. They're both applied by your equipment. But some armors have high damage resistance and lower armor. And I keep forgetting, after the damage is calculated, I also need to calculate the armor. And I need to calculate the damage resistance. And I don't like having that many things in the way of the dice roll and then the result. Now that's a personal problem, I suppose. But at the same time, I think it's enough of a problem that it's something that I want to address. I don't like that kind of game. I don't want to create the kind of game that I don't like. So I'm going to create a game with an emphasis on playability. Minimize the rolls and the rules that stop the game from progressing. How I intend to achieve this is having one offensive dice roll and one defensive dice roll, and then some simple damage calculation. No percentage-based system, just be able to work out, okay, this is how much damage I deal. Done. With that in mind, that's put some difficulties on structuring the combat engine, because it means I've got less to work, like I got less potential to work with. Because I could have, 6 dice rolls in a row, but that means that turns would take like a year for one turn and you'd never complete a scenario, and that's not fun. But the constraint that it puts on it also is an important constraint to have. If I don't have that constraint, if I just let myself run rampant and say, calculate this, calculate that, calculate the other thing, I won't end up playing the game. Because I won't like it. And that's not what I want. So, Dev Rule 1. Game Design Rule 1. It needs to be playable. It needs to be simple enough to be able to play without a calculator beside you. Design goal numero 2. It needs to be thematic. The systems that make up the game, I want to be closely tied to the very concept that the game is. The theme that the game creates, and that is fighting robots. Total Biscuit did a discussion fairly recently about a card game that's like a WWE card game, in which various cards are played, and I don't know the game, I don't know the mechanics, but he went on a very long rant about how your game as a card game, as a board game, needs to use what board games have to make the systems non-generic, to make the systems of the game match the theme of the game. And in that particular system, like, you didn't have a health meter or a damage indicator to dial down, because that's not how wrestling works. You had a stamina mechanic where eventually you run out of cards, and once you run out of cards, you lose. Things like that. That whole game design philosophy where your game's mechanics should match the theme is important to me, because it makes your game more itself. And whilst it does reduce the ability for players to make the game that they're after out of it, it does mean that your game can't just be replaced with another generic game, because there are pen and papers by, like, at least one is called Fate, and Fate is designed in such a way that anything is possible. Like it's a rules light game. I don't know how it works again. I haven't played it myself, but from what I've heard, it wouldn't be too complicated to take Fate and go, well, instead of Fate, I'm gonna play robots. I'm gonna take these game rules into a different world. I don't necessarily want that to be capable. Like, potentially, if the fighting engine turns out to be really robust and people really enjoy the way it works, then sure, by all means, go ahead. But I want it to be based around the concept of robots fighting. Keep all the mechanics thematic to that. Not just in what they're called, but in the way everything works with itself. I want it to seem like robots are fighting when you're rolling your dice. So everything needs to be thematic. And number 3, I want this game to be non-generic. I want to use original systems to represent the theme. I don't want the theme to be detached in any way. I've set 2 design goals for this express purpose. Theme needs to follow the system. System needs to follow the theme. They need to be so tightly bound as far as I'm concerned. Not so tightly bound that they can't be unwoven if that's what you really want to do, but I definitely don't want it to feel like a D&D clone or any other game. I want it to be its own game. It'd really suck if it turns out I actually accidentally make a game that already exists because I haven't done any research. Yeah, terrible example of how to do things, but that's where I'm up to. And that brings us to design goal number 4. This game, and this is something I'm definitely taking inspiration from anima-wise, this needs to be customizable. I want to allow users to generate their own custom weapons, equipment, skills, and generally create their own personalized story. I want user-generated content to be prevalent, particularly if this develops some kind of community with online sharing. Anima Beyond Fantasy has more races in user-generated content forums that are agreed to be balanced. Like, this isn't just the random stuff people have thrown out because they wanted something particular and don't know how to do. Like, this is actually properly balanced by highly experienced GMs, and everyone agrees that these should be in rulebooks. There's more races there than there are actually in the game, and there's a fair number of races. Interesting ones too. I want a similar thing. You can't do as much with what I currently have. It's less flexible than anima, but that stands to reason because I'm not trying to base it off all anime, just all robot fighting scenarios. Sounds a lot more broad when I say it like that. Weapons, in particular, are quite easy because if I have a system for generating weapons and I can say, okay, this is roughly balanced, and I don't know that I can yet, but we're still working on things. I wouldn't be opposed to releasing that system to the public so that they can create their own weapons with their own special systems. And I would in fact encourage everyone to do so because it evolves and progresses the game outside of what I'm capable of as a single person working on a solo project. And if you want something for your world, I don't see why you shouldn't be able to have it. Vampire the Masquerade is... I don't know if it's notoriously uncustomizable, but it's... The game sets itself up so that customization is almost not a thing. Your vampire, personal-wise, like your stats, yes, you can customize that, but you can't customize the game itself. Maybe someone out there has worked out a way to make the combat actually decent in that game, but that's not the emphasis, so maybe they haven't. And adding your own skills is possible, with obviously the consent and input from your GM, but everything that it already has is so broad that that's not a problem. You don't need to add your own skills. And the disciplines, the actual vampire powers of your vampire, not customizable. Like, you can't create your own content there without looking at some insane, like truly insane things. That's a massive amount of work, because you need lore reasons and balancing stuff like that. There's no system to do that. I'm sure someone's done it, don't get me wrong, but it's an extremely complicated endeavor to look at the disciplines and go, I'm going to create a new discipline. And more importantly, within the lore of the world, you're not supposed to be able to. It's possible because new disciplines arise, but the character is not supposed to be that unique. And that stuff limits the game's growth. It controls the game's growth, that's for sure, but it also limits it, and that makes me sad. That's not what I want. What I want is a game that people can take and modify quite easily with their own, like adding their own content. I don't necessarily want them to modify the engine or the theme, but definitely their own content. If that's what they want to do, go right ahead. Go right ahead. And the last little thing before we finish up here, I want this game to be fun. I want it to be fun to play. I also want it to be fun to GM. Now, I only really... I know a few GMs, and some of them just get frustrated, and because GMing is hard, and they don't derive as much enjoyment out of it as... Or at least they don't tell me that they're deriving enjoyment out of it. They're like, oh god, it's so much effort. And I agree entirely. But at the same time, watching people have an epic robot fight, or listening to people describe their epic robot fight and adding your own input as you imagine the scenario unfolds, together creating that epic battle between two giant death robots. I want that. So it's got to be fun to play. It's got to be fun to roleplay. Roleplay is of course separate to playing, because playing the game is just rolling dice and imagining the scenario. Roleplaying is actually taking on your character and having character development. I want the pilots in the world to be fun to be. Now, I can't make you make an interesting character, but I would like the game to support role-playing and have it generally fun. I've got a few things in character creation that are exactly for that. But that's later on the line, before that discussion can happen. I want it also to be fun in both a once-off game. Like, I want it to be perfectly fun to just, okay, we've got some guys together, we're going to play a game that's got no overarching plot, we're just going to do a mission. We're going to deal with this scenario. I want that to be enjoyable, just as much as I want a long-term scenario campaign with dramatic overarching plots, recurring characters, themes, arc, villain, or even like you versus your small mercenary band versus a giant mega corporation bent on globe domination. That'd be cool. I want that to be just as fun. I want one-off and long-term to be just as fun, and ideally... Now, funness is not something I know how to make. I can just make the game and hope that it's fun. But ideally, in addition to all those levels of fun, I also want it to be fun to listen to. Now, this might be just because I'm a self-interested a-hole, but if I can create a game that someone Twitch streams, just one guy, and just 5 guys listen to it, or watch it, then I will be the happiest man on earth. That's all I really want, because, like, that means I've succeeded. I've created something not just for myself, but for someone else. And that's my only real goal. So that's where we're at to. Where we're at to, we're up to. Yeah. I will join you again for another brief chat in the future. Thank you, and good night.
Spotted a vanguard!